Boston, Massachusetts, home of winning sports teams, elite universities, and sometimes a lot of snow. But some might say that there are two Bostons. I came to Boston to attend Northeastern University for grad school, but there was something about Boston that was noticeable to me. It almost felt as though Boston had effectively hidden its Black population. So I had to ask myself, what happened to all the Black people?
One new source of industrial manpower is the Negro, recruited from the South by the thousands, giving up 50 or 75 cents a day jobs for the lure of higher paid war work in the North. The migration, which will have a profound effect on the course of American life, is accompanied by conflict. Race riots in northern communities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and East St. Louis, Illinois, where 37 Americans are killed, white and Negro.
Oftentimes, when the Great Migration in the United States is discussed, Boston is omitted from that part of the conversation. The Great Migration, where Black Americans moved from the South to northern cities to get better paying jobs. Oftentimes, these jobs were at factories or other plants. But Boston was also a part of the Great Migration. After World War II, thousands of Black people moved from the South to Boston. And even times, if you were to look up or research history, it's almost very difficult here in Boston to find this information. It's almost as if we were never here. My name is Sabrina Salvati. I host a political podcast called Sabs, where I discuss issues that are often overlooked by mainstream media. One of those issues that I'm very passionate about happens to be gentrification. Gentrification is when wealthy, affluent people begin to populate a neighborhood that is poor or working class. And oftentimes, Black communities are hit the hardest by gentrification. Now, gentrification is something that Boston City Councilor candidate Reggie Stewart knows all too well.
Over here, they're building a residential building, I think 34, 36 units, something like that. The only problem is if you look at the income levels in this neighborhood, particularly in regards to Black people, we're at about 30 to 40% AMI at best for most of us. So what that means is that whatever is built here, the vast majority of people that live here or would seek to stay here or even return here after being pushed out, they're not going to be able to afford it, point blank. And when I see the bike racks here, the fact that those are here and that this hasn't gone through the entire process signals to me that the developers feel like this is a done deal. Black people specifically are being pushed out. There was a study that I came across that found of the top 10 cities that had more than 10 instances of gentrification within the urban centers. Boston came up in the 70s, I believe it was third, then again in the 80s, and again in 2010. So you're seeing over decades that the intensity of gentrification, Boston is towards the top of that list. What that means is that Black people are literally removed. If you look at the census data from 2010 to 2020, Black people decreased in population size and share. The white population has increased, the Hispanic population has increased, the Asian population has increased. Black people are the ones that are being removed. They're ending up in places like Brockton and other areas outside of Boston because developers come here, raise the rents or raise the prices, which triggers the few homeowners in the area with higher property taxes, many of them elderly and on fixed incomes. So they have to sell because they can't afford that sharp increase in taxes. And so the developers build here and snatch up properties as people get sold, flip them into condos that we can't afford, raise the rents to the point that we can't afford. If you look at City Hall and the State House, no one's talking about that specific racial and historical component that Black people are the only ones who are leaving.
Believe it or not, redlining made gentrification possible. Redlining allowed financial institutions to refuse or limit financial services to certain neighborhoods based on their race. Now, this practice was absolutely discriminatory. Picture this. Imagine a map of Boston. Now imagine that some of those neighborhoods are shaded with the colors red, green, blue, and yellow. Well, this was an alert to financial institutions. It alerted them that the red neighborhoods should not receive financial services regardless of the household income. Again, this was 100% discriminatory, but it happened. And this ultimately led to gentrification. If you're a developer, or if you're someone that has higher income, looking at those red neighborhoods, you are able to know that the property values in those neighborhoods were significantly low. So as a developer, you can buy up as many homes in that neighborhood as you want, renovate them, and sell them. You see this happening today with all of the high-rise condos that are appearing in multiple urban communities across the country. One of Boston's more infamously redlined neighborhoods is Roxbury. Roxbury resident Antonia is a reparations activist in Boston. She's not only fighting back against gentrification, but Antonia's focus is specifically for American freedmen. American freedmen are those that were released from slavery in the United States. Antonia is a descendant of American freedmen.
So right now we're centered in Roxbury, Mass. And if you look around, this is now named Nubian. There was a group of people who got together and thought that it would be better to name it something Afrocentric other than being Dudley Station, the old name, which was a slave master. This was a thriving, bustling community, and there was a lot of Black, African-American, American freedman spirit in this community. There was a lot of businesses. And if you look around now, there's nothing that represents us here. This corner was Nubian Ocean, and it was a variety store that had everything. And then further down was the trinket store that had Afrocentric statues, jewelry. It had Black cards. It had anything that tied us back to the motherland. However, if you look around now, the businesses here don't represent our culture. Look at the storefronts as we go down. There's really nothing here that's American freedmen related. We really don't have any businesses that reflect us in our own community. These were buildings here. They tore them down. I don't know what they're building there. They never said anything. This is Foot Locker today. It used to be Walgreens. So we have no pharmacy in the immediate area. And another thing in our community, we don't have our own supermarket. Around the 1960s and 70s, we had Blair's Supermarket here. Nubian Square right now is the most deserted area. All the communities are thriving, like Fields Corners, Uppers Corner. You have Codman Square, you have Mattapan bustling. We have really nothing, but the rents are higher here. And mostly affordable houses here, the minimum income is $100,000. And our people don't make that kind of money here in the city of Boston. Everything that's being built around here is being gentrified. This right here is all new. This was Whittier Street Projects. It was all bricks. They tore that down to make affordable housing. One of the biggest things down here is, we call them the methadone mild mass and cast people. This area is really saturated with drug addiction. The police and the fire ambulance are down there because there's always overdoses in this area. So you just don't want to be in the area where this is what you call home for 50 years, and this is what you got to deal with. This is Frugal Bookstore. This is the biggest staple in our community that's Black owned. It's our bookstore. They've been in the community for quite some time. Beautiful bookstore. Every genre of literature that you want is in here. And that is the only Black American freedman business in this community. This park was called Washington Park, and they named it Malcolm X Park. This park was really a staple in our community, along with other city parks. My mom basically raised us to come to this park. You don't see as much activity here as you did when I was growing up. So I'm talking about the 60s and 70s, where it was packed on the weekends with baseball teams, like multiple teams would play right back to each other. So we don't really have a whole lot that goes on here now, and I never knew why. I don't understand why. This is Washington Street, and so this is where some of the businesses were at. The two oldest landmarks on this street are Drains. That was one of the original hair salons, and next to it is the Silver Slipper where Malcolm X went. Look at the Silver Slipper. So that represents our heritage. That represents an iconic landmark where Malcolm X came from. We can't find the records or pictures to show a thriving Black American communities. Like, I'm looking for the pictures from 1940s, 1950s. They've been erased. So when you look up this area, you'll see the Caucasians, the Jews used to live here, but you won't find anything thriving for Black Boston or Black Americans. And so we've been erased.
And speaking of Malcolm X, the city of Boston had decided to make his family home a historical site, which is why I was quite surprised to see that his family home was in such poor condition. Why was it like this?
When you own an historical landmark, you might be eligible for some funds to help with the upkeep or maintenance of a property, but it's primarily your responsibility. It's very difficult if an historic property is owned by a private individual. They see that as the family's responsibility versus a nonprofit. It's much easier for a nonprofit to raise money and say, like, we need to fix the roof on this house. Donors aren't as willing to come and fix your roof.
Now, with every problem, there's supposed to be a solution. The solution to redlining was a program called Urban Renewal. The reason why Urban Renewal was considered a solution to redlining is because Urban Renewal involved clearing out these so-called slum areas and building new housing, new businesses, new developments. Now, with those new businesses and housing, that would mean that the property values in the red line areas would now be greater. This would mean that banks would be willing to lend money to those families in that area. But unfortunately, Urban Renewal did the exact opposite. Urban Renewal led to more displacement.
The Madison Park section of Roxbury, what happened there was sort of an outgrowth of the urban renewal plans. It was a neighborhood where in the last 80, 90 years, people of great prominence came from that neighborhood, including the Haynes family with former state representative Michael Haynes, drummer Roy Haynes, who used to play with John Coltrane's band, with Sarah Vaughan and with Charlie Parker, as well as their brother Vinnie Haynes, who was an activist in that neighborhood. It was a vibrant neighborhood. Going back to the early 60s, the city looked at it as a potential site for a citywide campus. The idea was that the Boston Latin School and Girls Latin would remain separate, but all the other high schools in the city would be housed in one building. This would have been staggering. It would have been a huge building or building complex that the Boston Redevelopment Authority was planning on building. The Boston Redevelopment Authority has the power of eminent domain by which, once an area is declared a slum, it can take housing, pay the owners of the land what the BRA considered to be a fair market value, and then demolish their homes. At that time, you could declare a neighborhood a slum, and then if it had that slum designation, HUD would give a city or a city authority the funding to clear the slum. So the BRA was created as a quasi-governmental agency. And when it was formed, the thinking was that it would be too difficult to do the types of things that the Boston Redevelopment Authority needed to do to redevelop Boston. The city councilors whose constituents were in these neighborhoods would push back. The people would hold the city council, the mayor, responsible for the destruction of their neighborhoods. At the same time that these plans were being hatched, Governor Sargent and the state had a plan to extend Interstate 95 all the way into the city. Where Melniacas Boulevard was going to be a inner belt highway. So it would have stretched along the route of Melniacas Boulevard from Interstate 93 through the Fenway, through Central Square in Cambridge, and through Somerville, then reconnected with Interstate 93. That inner belt, combined with Interstate 95, would have created a pretty large barrier between Roxbury and the rest of the city. Some of the housing units there were run down. Some of them probably needed to be torn down. What ended up happening is that they did tear down a lot of housing. All along Melniacas Boulevard, there were about 2,000 housing units that were demolished in that area, so a lot of people were displaced. Additionally, they took down a lot of housing and commercial buildings along the Columbus Avenue corridor. So going all the way from Ruggles Street down to Jackson Square, the Boston Redevelopment Authority demolished a lot of buildings and took land. It would have been a massive highway interchange there at the corner of what's now Columbus and Melniacas, and the high school campus would have been right next to that. All of the buildings in that Madison Park neighborhood were torn down. So that was the general plan for urban renewal, the way the Boston Redevelopment Authority, its director, Ed Logue, the way they saw it. And it was pretty much reflective of the ethos across the country, that inner cities were full of slums. People looked down on those neighborhoods, and so they thought it made sense to tear those neighborhoods down.
The neighborhood of Roxbury, Massachusetts is not the only neighborhood in Boston where Black residents were displaced and are still being displaced today. In Dorchester, Black residents face the same fate. I met with the Franklin Park Defenders, a group of activists fighting back against gentrification to discuss issues of racial discrimination in Boston.
I was born and raised in Jamaica Plain, and people that look like me no longer live there. It's by design that they've created spaces where we are no longer seen anymore. They're wiping us out one community at a time. And as it spreads across the city, we're becoming extinct here. I hate to say it that way. So my family house on Montebello Road, we did capital improvements in 2019. And during the construction, a white family walked up to me and said, "Are you selling?" "No, I'm not selling." "Are you breaking them up into condos?" "No, I'm not breaking up into condos." She went on to say, this is a white woman speaking to me, "Our people live here now, and we want to live around our people, so you should sell."
Boston has always been, and is now, the most racist city, pound for pound, dollar for dollar, acre for acre, black family for black family. Right now, the whole city is becoming the reverse Middle Passage, the out-migration of black people like no other city.
This whole gentrification concept is not particular to Boston. It's what they did all over the country to black people because we became land bankers. That we came in, stabilized the land, kept the housing affordable and kept it usable and things of that nature. But as the land began to be productive, white people who moved out to the suburbs, white people, new migrants into the country, immigrants to the country, they saw this land as one affordable for them, and they wanted that land.
This is where we're at in a 400-year trajectory since the first Elizabethan Anglo-Saxons got here to found Boston and Harvard and New England. And we're so influential in the founding of the Republic.
This gentrification began a long time ago. There's been this push since the late 1800s to move Black people out of areas that were productive and useful and allow white people to take it over. Black community, which started in downtown Boston, which you'd call downtown Scollay Square. The Black folks who lived in North End and Beacon Hill, they were there because they were waterfront and they were doing the stevedore work. The nouveau riche did not want to live down there. And so as it improved and as the harbor area and everything around Beacon Hill started to grow up and be built up by a lot of Black workers and dock workers who made the quality of life better, they were being pushed in the southwesterly direction. We moved from what now is South End, and they started building that up in the late 1940s and 50s. But because they had to take care of the people who lived here in Boston, particularly the residents who were coming back from the war and folks who were coming as part of the Irish migration, things of that nature, they built public housing. They built housing that was affordable for people, the working class people of that time. And it served the purpose. But after it served the purpose, they had to take in consideration they had neglected all the other housing. The South End was changing. And so they kept pushing Black and brown people further in the southwesterly direction. And so we came into what was Roxbury, and they started building up and making it worthwhile. It was a thriving community because it was considered the suburbs of Boston. In the 1960s, a guy named Tony Downs wrote a book called Opening Up the Suburbs. And his plan was to move low and working class people, particularly Black people, out of the inner city and move them out into small communities in the suburbs, and then retake the inner city so that you had a mass of wealthy people living in the city. One of the problems with moving Black people into the suburbs is that the U.S. federal government, based on racist concepts of Black people, they would not give housing, they would not give loans, they would not give mortgages to Black people. So while they built developments and complexes for white people to move in the suburbs, they only wanted Black people to move in areas that were controlled, and they were not making funds available. So this whole plan of gentrification isn't a new concept. In every city you go into in the Northeast, and of course, in the West, and San Francisco is probably one of the better examples, they kept moving Black people out of the inner city into suburban areas where there's less transportation, less opportunity for jobs, and clearly a totally different concept of living in existence. So it's a plan. It's been in place for a long time.
I was born in a house on Monroe Street. 21 was the number, was a 6-family brownstone, which was snatched by City of Boston during urban renewal. I was 2 when we had to move in 1963 from that house. That displaced us to a place, what is now the Dudley Triangle. That house was replaced by, oddly enough, a playing field for years. And then we were given the option to take an apartment at Marksdale Gardens. So think of the dynamics of gentrification. The idea that we would take generational wealth from people, put people in an apartment, and then say, look at what we've built, all brand new, shiny, for your occupation, for rent. That was in the day termed Negro removal. People will tell you all day long that, we don't do that anymore. While the gentrification displacement equation isn't as bad as 1963, it hasn't gotten much better now.
I was a Boston public school teacher and teaching at BC and at Harvard and at Roxbury Community College in the 90s. I have over 2,000 former Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan students, most of whom no longer live in Boston. I once had a student, there was a sidewalk auction of his home right outside the front door of the school, visible from our classroom. We had to pull the curtains down so this young 7th grade boy wouldn't have to see his family 3-generation house across the street on Kearsarge Avenue near Dudley Square auctioned.
I moved into Roxbury 24 years ago and probably was a gentrifier. It was much to my horror that I realized what I was living in the middle of. The former occupancy of the building had been Section 8 housing. Almost immediately, the people I met and the neighbors I met and came to like and respect were telling me about the history of our corner of Roxbury, which had started to become pickings for the wealthy. The South End had been outpriced for white middle-class people wanting to move back into the city, and they were actually advertising homes in Roxbury as the new South End. And this is in a neighborhood which is called Highland Park, where some of our more luminary leaders had been fighting for a black model community. That never happened. When the mayor decided she wanted to put in Roxbury more dense micro units, the mayor and her people in the city put their thumb on the scale. They appointed 3 new commissioners to our Architectural Conservation District Commission and outvoted the neighborhood. So we now have, going up in a family neighborhood, which is zoned for triple deckers, a 7-story building with 39 micro units.
None of these buildings have been fully rented. Most of the rents are $5,400. But these are the buildings that you're saying are to help the housing issue. No, it's not at $5,400. When you have the affordable units staying vacant because they can't pass approval, you can't really be sitting here fighting for housing if you're not inspecting what you expected them to do. So they're getting away with it. This is gentrification.
There have been lots of games over the years that the city has tried to play in order to try to hold on to the city's population that have not worked well.
Now, to Rod's point, Boston does try to find ways to hold on to the population that is currently here. But some of the games that have been played with the Black population, in particular in Boston, lies in the area of virtue signaling. For example, former Mayor Marty Walsh, he started an event called the Donna Summer Roller Skate Night. Donna Summer, probably one of my favorite singers of all time, is a legend and should be honored in Boston. I think a Donna Summer roller skate night was great. In fact, I actually went to the very first Donna Summer roller skate night. But we call this virtue signaling because if you are choosing to honor a Black singer that grew up in Boston, but at the same time, you are displacing Black people from their homes, this is just a game.
The policies are emblematic of moving people around and giving the impression that something's happening. But if you look at housing prices, they're not more affordable. A lot of that policy benefits folks with money, people who are investors. It doesn't really make things more affordable for folks who actually rent in the city of Boston.
There are a lot of people for whom this is not new. The thing is, it's overwhelming in ways I didn't quite anticipate as far as the rate of this gentrification, as it's called, which is the displacement of people, the structural and continuous impact. Make no mistake about it. It's not just bricks and mortar or the equity or the value of that bricks and mortar. It's cultural continuity. Okay, it's intergenerational, not just financial wealth, intergenerational self-knowledge wealth, which is worth more than financial wealth. And it's also the natural ecological wealth, the intergenerational cultural wealth of not only the most recent stewards for the last 75, 80 years, but really for the last 600. Former colonial governors, former Massachusetts tribe people, Algonquin speakers. There's evidence of all these people in your motherfucking backyards in Roxbury.
Now, the issue that brought the Franklin Park defenders together is the recent takeover of White Stadium, located inside of Franklin Park. Franklin Park is the largest and the last component of the Emerald Necklace. Located within Roxbury, it is bordered by Mattapan, Roslindale, and Jamaica Plain neighborhoods in Boston.
When I first approached by the mayor's office to look at this proposal that was coming in, the league had not been established. They were not an incorporated body, but they had already put together a plan and idea to have a soccer league in White Stadium in Franklin Park. The reason I was approached because I'm the president of the Garrison Trotter Neighborhood Association, a community-based neighborhood association, which has been around for 48 years. We've worked with the city in every aspect of what goes on in the neighborhood, but we were the group that basically helped form the core of individuals that set up the Franklin Park Coalition at the same time, in 1978. We took an interest in the park because it was our closest neighbor. It provided the most resources and access for us, but also a lot of the activities and programs that the community used. The schools in our community took advantage of White Stadium and the park. We supported people who had programs in the park on a regular basis, everything from mass, well-organized activities like the cross-country and the Cancer League and community birthday parties and roller skating. And so the neighborhood groups and organizations that had activities went to Franklin Park. So we took an interest in Franklin Park, and the interest was how to get it respect, how to get it support, how to fix it up, because it was totally neglected. For Olmsted Creation, one of the greatest landscape architects in this country, to be treated that way, it said to us something else is wrong. There's something wrong to have this 500-acre park be abandoned, to have the golf course only have 9 of 18 holes working, to have the zoo with the animals not getting the support and things that they needed to make it a world-class zoo, that things were being taken out of the park rather than being put in the park. And when you stop to think, 10% of what they spent on the Boston Common was going into the maintenance and care of Franklin Park. And that's why the Franklin Park Coalition came along to save that park. From 78 to 98, we worked hard to make sure the park grew and that it was taken care of, repaired, and fixed up. That stadium was a part of the park. And the activities that we went to, the stadium represent safety, represent organized space, it represent a place that people could bring their programs and kids. It was an active park.
Growing up there, flying kites as a child, we lived in that park and in that stadium for as long as I can remember. To be able to find that one quiet place when life beats you down Monday through Friday, it has been Franklin Park for us. That one place where we could find peace, tranquility. It has been a place where friends that we haven't seen for years, we connect there. Some of them live on a different side, on the other side of Franklin Park, and we live on the other side, and we meet in the middle in Franklin Park in White Stadium. Franklin Park has been a place for me where we have built community. It's been a place where we come together, our cultures come together, and we utilize the one of the few green spaces left for Black and brown people. And all these things are at risk.
So the idea that they were going to turn this over to a private concern, in the beginning, the neighborhood association I represent, Garrison Trotter, said, that sounds like a good idea. Let's explore it. We thought that they would fix it up, utilize it partially for the activities of a soccer league, and that the rest of the time would be for the use of students. When we got the actual proposal, we were able to see that they had no intention of making it a public space. They had no intentions of making it usable and accessible to the public and to the communities that were there. They wanted to take it over and control it. We had seen this example before in the South End on Columbus Avenue when Northeastern University took over that park.
Ah, yes, Northeastern University. This is an institution that I'm very familiar with because this is where I attended grad school. It's what brought me to Boston. When I came to grad school here at Northeastern University, I didn't know that this was Roxbury. When I applied to come to grad school here, this neighborhood was described as the Fens. And I remember just saying to myself, oh, okay, well, that's an interesting neighborhood. I wasn't familiar with that neighborhood in Boston, had never heard of that term. I found out later on that Northeastern University had Roxbury change the zip code so that Northeastern wouldn't be in Roxbury. The university came here to invade Roxbury, but didn't think Roxbury was good enough for Northeastern to have that same zip code. Northeastern University is probably one of the more prominent examples of gentrification in the neighborhood of Roxbury. What was once a commuter college increased in the rankings by becoming a more competitive school. And in doing so, that meant that Northeastern University had to expand. You can see that expansion. You can see the change in the neighborhood on Huntington Avenue when you look across the street and you see a poke station and a shawarma shop. And right down the street from Northeastern University is Orchard Park Housing Projects. This is where the popular R&B group New Edition called home. I spoke to a longtime resident of Orchard Park who had quite a bit to say about the city's efforts to remove Black people.
There was a lot of positive things going on. We had a neighborhood center here. It was the after-school program where a lot of kids came together and we shared our knowledge. You can learn music, you can learn martial arts, you can learn dance. There's a whole lot of cultural things you can learn there, which is now no longer the neighborhood center. We had basketball hoops here where kids were able to play basketball. They tore all the hoops down. We had nice playgrounds and jungle gyms where now if you go around here, you might find maybe one or two. This whole thing originally was by design. It was by design to get the Black men out of the household. But if you want to qualify for the subsidy to stay here, you could not have a man living with you at that point in time. You had to be either a single mother or someone with public assistance. And if you received public assistance, the father could not have been there. But I could say in my personal family, I knew my father, but he didn't live with me. When they want you to move, they offer you something or they bait you with something. They'll say, okay, you're subsidized here, but if you move, we'll give you a Section 8 voucher. And then they even help you find one like Fall River or New Bedford or maybe Lynn, or they'll help you find somewhere to live.
Wow.
But you're not gonna be here.
Do you see gentrification in the projects?
That's everywhere. So I've been to places like Atlanta, I've been to Detroit, I've been to some of these places where the downtown was small. Then next thing you know, the downtown expanded 30 miles. So originally, Black folks, we used to live in downtown. Then we moved to the South End. If you go to the South End now, you have to be a millionaire to live there.
The South End, one of the more grotesque examples of gentrification in Boston. The South End used to be a working class neighborhood. Now there is a great divide, where one half of the South End is for the ultra rich, and the other side is what remains of what the South End used to be, the working class people. If you exit Mass Ave T Station and walk down the street, you can see the intersection of where old meets new, at Mass Avenue and Columbus Ave. One of the more popular businesses that represents the old South End is Wally's Jazz Cafe, a Black-owned business that is very successful in Boston. Hopefully, Wally's will never have to leave.
In the early 50s, the Boston Redevelopment Authority tore down the New York Streets section of the South End. It was named the New York Streets section of the South End because the streets were named after towns and cities in New York. Albany Street is one of the last vestiges of that. It's the area between Albany Street, Washington Street, where the Massachusetts Turnpike is now, and then East Berkeley Street. Mel King, who grew up in that neighborhood, in his book Chain of Change, it was a very vibrant neighborhood. In the eyes of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, it was a slum. The BRA took a wrecking ball to that neighborhood. They sold land to the Herald for $1, where the Herald built its offices and printing plant at that time. But an entire neighborhood was erased. One of the next neighborhoods that the Boston Redevelopment Authority trained its eyes on was Castle Square, which was right next to the New York Streets area. Mel King was kind of a linchpin in this movement. When they tore that neighborhood down, King helped organize the Black and Chinese American people who lived there. What they sought was to gain control of the land and to build low-income housing there. And that's exactly what happened. It was the first time in the city that there was this model of the BRA would tear down a neighborhood and the community would organize and gain control of the land and determine what goes there. A similar thing happened in Madison Park in the mid-60s. They created a community development corporation, and then they obtained control over that land that was not used for the high school. And they built subsidized housing community there. That community has survived.
So this is Blue Hill Avenue. It goes from Dudley Street all the way up to Mattapan. And when there was white flight back in the 1960s, Black people migrated here to the Roxbury area and also Dorchester area. And this was all Black American freedmen. So this is one of the communities that my family first migrated to. My family migrated from South Carolina due to racial terror. They lived on Faison Street first, and then they moved to Roxbury on Cedar Street. Initially, Blue Hill Avenue had trolley cars on both sides. And the reason why they got rid of the trolley cars and gave us buses is because they built the highway so it'd make it easier for white people to commute to the city. So this was a flourishing, thriving community for American freedmen. And the community became demolished or deteriorated during the Civil Rights Movement when Martin Luther King was assassinated. So all this was burnt down. Everything was burnt down, totally demolished, was never built back up. This is where the riots mostly took place. Most of the churches here are unable to sustain, so they're either losing the church buildings or they're selling them. It's vacant, look at it. You see the windows, look at the border of the windows, look at that. See how the property's not taken care of? The Civil Rights Movement springboarded and created the Immigration Act, which allowed all groups of immigrants to come to America. According to the stats, 1% of Black immigrants were in America, less in the city of Boston. And most of these businesses, if you go from Dudley Street, which is the bottom of the hill, all the way up to Mattapan, were Black immigrants, Hispanic, Haitian, West Indian, Caribbean, and you won't find any Black businesses that are American freedmen. And we're trying to figure out where do we fit into the scheme of things. And so I'm sitting on the Reparations Task Force. My thing is to think of ways of making recommendations to right the wrongs. And so a part of making those repairs is how do we get American freedmen just as thriving as any other group of people in the city of Boston. One of the biggest things that I advocate for is a protected status for the American freedmen. The harms that need to be recognized the most are those that were incurred prior to 1965 with the Civil Rights Movement. Massachusetts sanctioned slavery with the Bodies of Liberty. We were enslaved in the United States, we were enslaved in Boston. American freedmen carry the bulk of the badges and incidents of slavery, and we can't carry the stain of slavery. My ancestors went through civil rights, they went through segregation, they went through, you know what I'm saying, Jim Crow. They went through enslavement, sharecropping, and Black codes, and people don't even know our history. Our ancestors were lynched, castrated, forced ancestral breeding, violations of rights, not being able to bleed, whipped, killed, just for being Black. I'm 3 generations removed from slavery. My mother was an illegal sharecropper as a child. They didn't move here until she was 14. My grandparents on both sides, mother and father, were sharecroppers because their parents were slaves. And so it wasn't that far ago. There's a huge significant difference in lived experiences in America, and especially the city of Boston and Massachusetts, than any other group of people. And we know this because of the wealth report. We're at $8, whereas other groups of people are driving much more than us. So they didn't suffer like my ancestors and my elders suffered. My ancestors and my elders were denied homeowner loans, business loans, while other groups of people were incentivized. I want everybody to succeed, but it bothers me sometimes when I look at other people that come here and only been here for a year, you know, and they're thriving. And then they look at it like we're not thriving because we're lazy. We only became lazy when we stopped picking cotton. That's a white trope. So I can't unsee and unlearn what I actually know from a learned experience. And so I'm trying to figure out ways to right the wrongs. And I need the community to speak up about their lived experiences in the community because that's the only way the stories are gonna be told.
Boston leads the nation, #1, It is the most unaffordable, the least affordable city in the country for raising a child. Even though it is easily provable, it's the least expensive place, if you got the right connections, to launch a professional sports franchise. Unlocking this nationally unrivaled bargain depends specifically upon doing it at public Franklin Park's George Robert White Memorial School Children's Stadium. And it's been intentionally neglected for decades, on ice, for later redevelopment and community displacement in a distant future, which is now.
I'm happy to talk about a women's soccer team. When I first heard there was a women's soccer team coming to Boston, I was thrilled. I'm a soccer coach. When I moved my kids over from England and my daughter hadn't played soccer in England, she came over here and I thought, fantastic. And then I caught wind of the fact that they had never asked the neighborhood associations what they wanted, that it had never even come up for bid, that no other venture had been invited to bid on anything, least of all in a cherished national park that is widely used and enjoyed by the neighborhood. And then when I saw the first photograph of these women in their affluence and their political connections, I was mortified. I will never stop being a feminist, but I will never defend women who are just as greedy as their menfolk. And that's what this is about. So women's soccer, I'm all over it. A women's private franchise for rich women and people who make money out of it to help a corrupt mayor, I'm not all over that.
The proposal was done illegally, and no one has picked up on that fact. For the amount of resources that are being spent, there should have been an automatic trigger that the state got involved in looking at the environmental impacts of what is being proposed, because the project is now over $100 million. The proposal by the soccer league overwhelms the community in which it's in, because when you have games and you have activities this size, you need laydown space. You need space for your trucks, for assistance, for your vendors, for media. There's no space around that stadium that can be used that's not in violation of Chapter 97 laws, which means they have to take public parkland in order to create the space they need for private use of that stadium. They have now cut off in their design the space around the stadium, which is public parkland, so that their people who are coming for the games, who pay $50, $60 for a ticket, could have private use of space, which is public parkland. And that's in violation of the law, and it's a disrespect that you would take public parkland from a community and then give it to a private group to control it.
And once all that's done, and for years, all of your profits from selling beer, wine, fancy apparel are all sheltered because you're doing so in a designated Trump-era 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, quote unquote, opportunity zone, which this park sits smack in the middle of, that gives unprecedented protection to those profits. The city's giveaway of $100 million to lower the cost of these women's investment and completion on time of opening for game day, which is required, is a really bad shell game and a bad precedent. You know, once they just have the first game in the 2026 season, they will have doubled their money just off of the value of their license. They could walk away, make a profit, and Boston is left with this big, ugly Easter church hat and all the maintenance and everything else that goes along with it.
These people have never shown to this community or to the public in general how they are going to manage the traffic flow and impacts. Because 11,000 people looking for parking spaces, cut it down to 5,000. This part of the city was not designed for that. Logistically, it doesn't work. The stadium is done in two parts. The private part, which goes to the Unity Soccer League, which is now Boston League, Boston Nation, whatever it is, and the Boston Public Schools, which represents 2/3 of the development supposed to take place. The Boston Public Schools Facilities Department has never produced a comprehensive design of the work they were going to do. And for the sketches that they showed and the work that they were looking at, it was in violation of the agreement what Olmsted had, that no structures were to be built in Franklin Park, but their design is to build offices and spaces that they have things to do. and they're taking what was now public accessible space and closing and privatizing it. Boston Public School has no plan in place right now to say that when they build a structure and spend over $200 million, that it's going to be a benefit for the public schools. We've used these children, we use these communities as a backdrop. This park for gentrification represents a Trojan horse.
I think that Boston is different than any other city that I've lived in. And being a military kid, I've kind of, I've lived all over. I lived overseas, I've lived down south, I've lived in the Northeast, so we've moved around a lot. Coming from the South, racism there is more overt. It's very obvious, it's loud, it's in your face, like you don't question whether or not something is happening because it's racist. In the Northeast, and in Boston in particular, it is different because the racism that you often experience here is covert racism. It's more subtle. It's also structural racism. The public transportation system in itself is structural racism. In Boston, we have the MBTA. We call it the T. Other cities call this their subway. These are the trains that mainly go underground and sometimes above ground, et cetera. The MBTA in Boston has several stops in white neighborhoods. But the moment that you get to the Black neighborhoods, the moment you get to Roxbury and Dorchester and even Mattapan, you start to notice those MBTA stops are far and few. If you live in Dorchester and you don't live on the outskirt of Dorchester, your access to the subway is very limited. So if you don't live next to the Ashmont stop, then that means that you're probably gonna have to take the bus. You can take the Green Line, and there are several stops along the Green Line. The Green Line goes all the way from Newton to Heath Street, through Somerville now, which is another city right outside of Boston, also experiencing some gentrification. So you see it, you feel it. When I say it's structural, it means that the institutions that are in place are designed in such a way that make it more difficult for Black neighborhoods. I was so shocked when I moved to Boston and I realized that they still have busing programs here. I couldn't believe that. They have an education lottery where parents can enter their kid into this raffle of sorts. And if they win, then that means that their child gets to attend a school hopefully of their choice in one of the more wealthier white neighborhoods. You had kids in Roxbury and Dorchester getting on a bus to go across a highway to go to school in Newton, which is a very wealthy city right outside of Boston, to go to school with kids that they don't even interact with on the weekend, to go to school with kids that they don't even live in the community with. Then they have to get back on that bus, go back on the highway, and go back to their neighborhood in Roxbury or Dorchester. Now, I say that that is part of structural racism because instead of fixing the schools that are in Roxbury and Dorchester, they tell the parents, enter this lottery, and if you win, your child gets to go to one of the more privileged schools in a community where they know no one.
The racism in Boston was put on blast in the 1970s, and it goes back decades. There was a long-standing battle between the Irish, who gained control of city politics. We had a period of 100 years where there were Irish-American mayors. It only ended in 1993 when Thomas Menino became mayor. They controlled most of the State House and the Senate, and most of the city council seats were occupied by Irish Americans. Irish Americans at that time saw themselves in a zero-sum game. They had to fight the Yankees to gain political power. With political power came city jobs. And They controlled the city jobs when they controlled the mayor's office, when they controlled the city council, the school committee. During that period, it was incredibly difficult for Black people to get jobs in the schools, to get jobs in the police department, the fire department, to get jobs in City Hall or any part of city government. All of that began to change in the 1970s when NAACP and other groups filed lawsuits against the city. The schools was probably the biggest battle or the most public battle that the city fought. For years, Black people had complained that our children were in school buildings that were more aged, that were older and more dilapidated than those in the white community, that the schools were overcrowded. Children were taking classes in basements and boiler rooms. There were fewer teachers. Black students had textbooks that were decades old. The conditions in schools in majority white neighborhoods were significantly better. However, Black students were not allowed to go to those schools. The city was clearly out of compliance with state law against segregation in schools. The Black community had fought that battle in the 1850s and won that battle. The legislature outlawed segregation in schools in Massachusetts. So we were back again with the same issue. And the school committee, which was all white at that time, wouldn't budge on the issue. The NAACP and a bunch of Black elected officials and activists took the school committee and the city to court and won. Judge Garrity ran it under consent decree, mandating that schools be desegregated by busing, but also mandating that the schools hire and promote Black teachers, principals, janitors, just the whole gamut, because that whole system, there were very few Black people working in the school system. That led to profound changes in the school system, but also in the city, because, finally, as these consent decrees came down, Black people began getting access to jobs that they never had access to before. During that desegregation, white people in white neighborhoods became quite violent. They threw rocks at school buses that were bringing Black children in. The entire city felt like it was a war zone between white kids and Black kids.
I want you to allow the Black children to go back to Roxbury.
I would say that 90, maybe 95, 98% of the violence was white kids throwing rocks at us. I mean, I certainly went through that. Never threw rocks at white kids. White kids who came to our neighborhood for whatever reason weren't chased out. But if you went to South Boston, if you went to the white parts of Dorchester, you were taking your life in your hands. And a lot of Black people who came to visit Boston stepped into that conflict, not knowing what was going on, got called the N-word, got rocks thrown at them, people were beaten up. Those incidents made headlines. You saw racial violence all across the city. I think Boston, maybe at the time, didn't have much of a reputation for anything else. So the racism stood out.
It's interesting that some of the wealthy neighborhoods in Boston were once Black neighborhoods. Like, take Beacon Hill, for example. Beacon Hill is a very wealthy neighborhood in Boston. Ben Affleck, Uma Thurman, and John Kerry have all resided in Beacon Hill, just to give you an idea of how wealthy this neighborhood can be. But once upon a time, Beacon Hill was a neighborhood where slaves sought refuge. In fact, unless you grew up in Boston or you're here as a tourist, you may not be aware that the Museum of African American History is located on Joy Street in Beacon Hill. There's a reason for that. Again, this is where slaves sought refuge. Now, the neighborhood of Beacon Hill has very few Black residents.
All of our Black leaders are not here anymore to fight for us. We don't have any other Black leaders that could come up and support us and help us and speak out for us. We don't have that anymore. So who's speaking for us? It's sure not our mayor.
No, it sure isn't Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, who has been confronted about housing and gentrification in Boston multiple times throughout the years. It was about 3 years ago when I first approached Mayor Wu asking her about the housing situation in Boston. But who exactly is Mayor Michelle Wu? Well, she's originally from Chicago, Illinois, and she came to Boston to attend Harvard University. She later graduated from Harvard Law School. She then went on to work for Boston Consulting Group, otherwise known as BCG. Now, some may feel that because Mayor Wu isn't from Boston, that she may not have understood the struggles of Bostonians, especially Black Bostonians. She may not have understood the structural racism that is embedded in the city. Nevertheless, she went on to serve as a Boston city councilor, and then in 2020, she declared her candidacy for mayor. One of her major promises was to fix the housing situation. But since her time as mayor, she has allowed developers to build luxury apartments and affordable housing that isn't actually affordable. This is why some Bostonians have an issue with Mayor Wu. She professed herself to be this progressive champion that would tackle the housing crisis, and she turned out to be another mayor in bed with developers. Now, one redevelopment project that Mayor Wu's administration supported was the demolition of an apartment complex called Mildred Haley Apartments. These apartments are located in the neighborhood of Jamaica Plain. Formerly known as Bromley Heath, Mildred C. Haley Apartments was one of the apartment communities that I visited a couple of years ago because residents had complaints about black mold and rat holes that were found on the property. Mayor Wu promised that the city would allocate money towards these apartments to renovate them, to fix them up so that the residents can have an improved quality of living. In the end, this renovation ultimately led to displacement. And it's not just the residents of Mildred Haley Apartments that are dealing with displacement under Mayor Wu's reign. At one point, she even wanted to do this with schools. Mayor Wu considered removing the John D. O'Brien School of Mathematics and Science out of a Black community in Roxbury and transferring that school to a neighborhood called West Roxbury. Now, why is this significant? West Roxbury is a predominantly white, Irish, Catholic neighborhood. You had a mayor who describes herself as the first female person of color to be mayor in Boston, who wanted to take a STEM school from a Black community and put that school in a white neighborhood.
She's taken the land away from us, like urban renewal, moving a STEM school from where it was in Roxbury to West Roxbury, demonstrates this idea of this very authoritarian, paternal, and frankly, patently racist approach to governing that she has to own. When people show you what they are, you should believe them.
Now, there have been positives that Mayor Wu has done for the Black community. For example, recently she established a day called New Edition Day. This was to honor the popular R&B group New Edition and to name a street after New Edition called New Edition Way. This is a positive, this is a plus, this is something that is long overdue. New Edition came out in the 1980s, so it's only time that this should happen. But the unfortunate thing about this that I noticed when I was attending this event is that some of the people who gathered there to honor New Edition were people who grew up in Orchard Park, but were pushed out because their buildings were demolished. This is a living example of virtue signaling.
I think that the mayor, having run for one thing, is complicit in quite another. And gentrification, she wants people who graduate from our graduate schools to stay put and be rich and work in certain firms. And what she's not doing is looking after any of the people, like my friends and neighbors, who live here.
For 2.5, 3 years, I've been working with Madison Park Vocational Technical High School, the only vocational technical high school in the city. The only school could help young women and men, black and brown, black or white, get a real opportunity to live and sustain themselves in the city of Boston. They had set aside in their capital budget, in their capital bond bill, $550 million to rebuild, to redo, to create a new Madison Park High School. We were supposed to start in July of 2025, rebuilding the school that's most critical to the education and the future of the children in Boston. The mayor shelved that program, took the money, and said she will build this entertainment center for these multi-billionaires, regardless of the cost.
Why is the mayor willing to throw herself on this sword, do or die, for this project? It's not about soccer. It's more about professional soccer than it is about these children who won't be living here in 10 and 20 years because of gentrification and displacement. It's about the additional profits and capital gains that can be made in this entertainment complex, in this quote unquote legacy place of Olmsted or Boston, the country's most famous sports town, without having to pay what it would cost to build your own stadium anywhere. This is the last place where they could steal a stadium, repurpose a stadium, get all of the benefit of not having to pay private market costs for acquisition, construction, when you got the husband of Jennifer Epstein doing a no-bid general contract for the stadium. You've got women who are, before this proposal, this project, deeply, intimately associated with ownership of the Boston Celtics, the Boston Red Sox. So those are the future donors to this mayor's future political aspirations as a whatever. This mayor seems to be the biggest rising star in the Commonwealth and in the nation of what might be some perceived woke nuisance or threat nationally because of her public stance against ICE and the president and DEI and all of this other stuff that she does defend verbally in these televised platforms, but at home and on the ground, she has the most to gain politically, perhaps financially, with these investors who, like I said, couldn't be more obviously ill-suited, tone-deaf, unwelcome in this place. When you've got a mayor that's willing to give away so much of what is the taxpayers, what is the adjacent communities, what is really the Commonwealth under law, it's a perfect storm. And this project is something that the nation, the world, the Commonwealth, the city, everyone should be looking at more closely than that. This, I told you, this is Katrina. This is Emmett Till's mama pulling back a curtain. And if people don't look at what's behind that curtain, it's coming to them.
In 2025, Mayor Wu had a challenger. His name is Josh Kraft. He is the son of New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft. But don't get it twisted. Josh Kraft may be opposed to the takeover of White Stadium in Franklin Park, but his father, Robert Kraft, wants a soccer stadium in Everett, Massachusetts, for the New England Revolution, which is the male soccer team that he owns. Now, one has to wonder, is it possible that Josh Kraft could be opposed to the takeover of White Stadium because of his family's interest in building a new stadium for the New England Revolution in Everett? But what's the big deal? Why does it matter if the Kraft family wants to build a new stadium in Everett, Massachusetts, as opposed to supporting the takeover of White Stadium in Franklin Park? Well, you see, no one sat down and thought about the logistics and the impact on the residents in these communities, especially when it comes to Everett. It was just a couple of years ago that the Encore Casino was brought to Everett, Massachusetts, after many residents were against it because they knew that this would increase traffic and it would make things worse for them. This is the same problem that residents in Franklin Park will also have to deal with. And it brings me to another issue, and that is the Olympics. In 2015, Boston, Massachusetts was considered to host the 2024 Olympics. Now, there was a lot of pushback from residents in Boston that said, absolutely not. Do not bring the Olympics here. We don't have the infrastructure to support it. And Marty Walsh chose to listen to the residents as he was mayor at that time. I really believe that this support for the U.S. women's soccer team in Boston, Massachusetts, in Franklin Park, at White Stadium, is just the beginning. I truly believe that Boston and Boston's leadership is planning on trying to host the Olympics at some point in time. And what greater place to do that than at White Stadium in Franklin Park? While redlining, urban renewal, and gentrification are three pieces of the puzzle that led to the erasure of Black Boston, there is still one piece that is missing from this puzzle, and that piece is mass incarceration.
My name is Mac Hudson. From Roxbury, Dorchester. I work for Prison Legal Service, part of the Racial Equity and Correction Initiative. I also have my own organization called Access Mass, which deals with racial inequity in the Black and brown community. So what happened to me is not uncommon. I and others were the first juveniles that were prosecuted as adults in Massachusetts and sent to maximum security prison. I served 33 years, mostly for a crime I did not commit. This was like something that had been thought of as a means to funnel more young Black folks into our criminal system, as well as to the institutions itself. What we know now today to be called mass incarceration. Massachusetts has specific laws that deal with juveniles. They have a whole separate process. One of them is called a bind over hearing, meaning that if you get charged with something that they think is heinous or something that should be prosecuted as an adult, there's a process by which they put you through in order to determine to see whether or not you could be rehabilitated as a young offender. If not, through that series of tests, then they prosecute you as an adult. However, in the late 1980s, what they started doing was prosecuting young Black 17-year-olds. 17-year-olds are juveniles. At 18, you're considered an adult. What Massachusetts decided to do was say at 17, you were an adult, which would be in disharmony with the remaining parts of the law. So what this allowed them to do was send droves of children all across Massachusetts, especially in Boston, straight to maximum security prison. Eventually, after 33 years, the parole released me after looking at my case and saying that they felt there was something historically wrong with the identification in that case. Massachusetts really broke up the ecosystem of young blacks coming into the system by allowing this ambiguous interpretation in which everyone had to know was wrong. We're not situated like other states where other states don't have juvenile settings to prosecute. We have a specific setting for it. So that's how a lot of us went up to maximum security, and ever since then, it's been getting younger and younger and younger. Miller versus Alabama, Brian Stevenson basically debated with the Supreme Court about the legitimacy of prosecuting young offenders as adults because they've outlived adult offenders twice their age. That arose to an issue of cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court actually recognized that. That Miller case became the precedent for every other state to kind of follow suit when readdressing whether or not first-degreeers or second-degreeers should receive a life sentence, who were juveniles at the time, between the ages of 17 and lower. And Massachusetts came out with a case called Commonwealth versus Diachenko, which looked at not just the Eighth Amendment, but also Article 26 of the Massachusetts State Declaration, and determined that, yes, they should follow Miller because it is supreme law, and that they was just going to deal with first-degreeers. But they never addressed all of those who were prosecuted and sent upstate as juveniles. So the question is not about the Eighth Amendment, but more about the due process. Where did we find due process at when folks were supposed to intervene and say, hold on, we have a separate juvenile court to prosecute those offenders 17 and under? And this is not something that was started in Massachusetts. This was something that was universal going around at the time, nationally, on the heels of Hillary Clinton, who had called a bunch of us young juveniles as super predators that set the stage for this prosecution. And I would say this came out of a think tank somewhere, because when I spoke to older folks who were incarcerated, older black men who had been in the system, they had knew 2 years in advance that this change was going to come. They had been told that in the next 2 years, they would see young offenders come to maximum security prison unprecedented, like they never saw before. And when they started to see my generation of young folks come in that way, it was just, to them, it was like, what? Because number one, you don't send 17 or 18-year-olds to maximum security prison. In this case, they sent us straight there with hardened criminals, and that was a volatile place. And what I would say, basically to send us off to our executions, so to speak. We've survived that, but what didn't survive is the decimation of our families as a result of that. The class of would-be potential earners that would help stabilize Black Boston. And then when you look at who's taking accountability for what happened, even though we're now coming back and addressing this, no one doesn't want to take no responsibility, because you have prosecuted a slew of children for decades. The courts did not have the authority to do that. They did not, and still do not have the authority to do that. Once something becomes the status quo of the way of operation in Massachusetts, well, defense attorneys and all of them treated alike. And that has been the problem in Boston. And when we talk about those structural barriers of mass incarceration, it wasn't just the Reaganomics, right, that created the environment when they decidedly put drugs in the community, gave opportunity for guns in the community, that created the environment for us, and then promoted the gang style of life, because gangs did not exist in '89. This was something perpetuated by the media, who were coming to these little different blocks of ours and started asking us that, what gang are you from? What gang are you from? And we were saying, what gang? We ain't no gang. We just grew up on this block. We all from this one neighborhood. But we never fit the classical terms of gangs because there was no hierarchy, there was no structures, there was none of that. This is what they begin putting in our brain. And now, when you've been invisible for so long and you're looking for visibility, well, now some of these folks started playing to that hype, to that media sensation. And this is how you had the formation of gangs. So this is the recipe to how they set up these dynamics that led to then the prosecution side of ignoring the law and everybody turning their head to the law and then actually stealing generations from us. I was locked up 33 years. There's folks who, if not for the work of Brian Stevenson, they would still be locked up or they would be dying in prison. Some folks who served 40 years, some folks who served 20 years, 15 years, they're never getting that back. They done lost their family. Their family's been destabilized. Their sons and their children are now entering into the system because they didn't have the support. So they've been completely destabilized.
After hearing Mac's story, I couldn't help but think about the day I voted to legalize recreational marijuana in Massachusetts. Since then, a number of cannabis shops have opened in Massachusetts and they've become very profitable. And upon hearing Mac's story, I couldn't help but think about all the people that were in prison because of marijuana. Most of those people are Black people, in particular, Black men. So I wondered, how did Mac feel about the fact that Massachusetts legalized recreational marijuana and people are making a lot of money off of it, but the state has not pardoned those who went to prison for marijuana?
I think personally it's consistent with the type of apathy, right, that they've had when it pertains to the Black community, because most of those convictions come out of the Black community. One of the ways that they've been able to kind of avoid that is by saying, hey, well, at least we're opening up opportunity for Black folks to actually benefit from these cannabis shops, while not really looking at the harm, right, that the conviction still causes to the individual. What we see is this inconsistency that's always the question when it surrounds Black folks or when Black folks are most impacted. Look how long it took for them to do the Annie Dugan situation, where Annie Dugan was tampering with drugs and they sent a whole bunch of folks to prison who may not have ever had drugs in the first place, right? But to rectify that, it took a court fight all the way up to the Supreme Court years later after her conviction to then say, we have to do something sweeping to come back and reverse all those cases. If we recognize that in that instance, why wouldn't we recognize the impact of marijuana convictions the same way? What we see is that there is a major reluctance to come back and repair that type of harm. One has to ask themselves, why? What is the purpose of maintaining something that is legitimized? You didn't do it for the prohibition, right? Once alcohol became legal, all the other convictions went away. You know, people were able to get that stuff off their record. What is the difference here? Black Boston and the Massachusetts legislators and everyone who's cognizant of these things talk about it in an academic way as if real people are not walking around who were impacted by that. And that is the number one problem. And when we talk about what equity looks like, what real equity looks like, and for us, first, cleaning our slates. All those folks who were impacted by being prosecuted in that way should automatically get those cases nullified or designated as juvenile offenses. And you know what that would open up to? That would mean then we would be open for state jobs. We would be competing for those same things. They had to create that environment to malign us early on so that we wouldn't be competing for those same jobs on the same scale as white communities. Being able to get these narratives out to show the constructs of these things is very important.
Yes, Boston is home to winning sports teams and elite universities. But there are two Bostons. These are the faces of the other side of Boston. The side of Boston tourists and transplants are less likely to see. They are fighting back against the displacement of Black residents, but they are not alone. Black residents are being displaced in cities throughout the United States. We have to apply pressure on corporations and city officials. Otherwise, we'll be erased.
Ball hard, no lesser. This dry mind, no Tesla. This whip glide like Dressler. Full court, I bring pressure. I bring pressure. I bring pressure. I bring pressure. I bring